we will start with Francesca Bosco, who is a project officer at the Emerging Crimes Unit of the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute. Wow, what a long title,
long
Francesca.
one. Yeah, I know.
Yes. She works for the UN. That's also a way of presenting you. Francesca, we had discussions where we tried to be concrete, and some speakers were concrete and some others were not. And what are your reflections so far?
Well, actually, I feel a bit like a fish out of water here. My expertise is more with the bad guys, the really bad ones, so basically criminals. And since before were mentioned attack and cybercrime and various type, let's say, of attacks, and also different software used, for example, for investigation. I think that I would try to clarify a bit what cybercrime is or what are the threats. I mean, it's
Wonderful.
impossible in like 5 minutes, but I will try to be very short and just share with you a couple of thoughts on this. And also my personal, let's say, opinion is that the line between what is called, for example, hacktivism and what is called cybercrime sometimes is blurring, and also they were saying before the issue of the, let's say, the link between freedom of expression, security, human rights. I know that there are not many definitions. Unfortunately, legal people like definition. Sometimes they are useful because at least you can identify the different issues that we're talking about. There are not many, unfortunately, at the international level, but at least we can try to give concrete examples. And that's why I will try a bit to give concrete examples of cybercrime.
The stage is yours, Francesca.
Thank you so much. Well, the stage is mine, but please help me out and give me also your experience. As I mentioned, in our institute, we're dealing mainly with research and technical assistance to member states. In my case, specifically on the issue of cybercrime and cybersecurity. As I mentioned, well, I decided to use this picture about what's happening every minute of a day on the internet. And as you might see, I mean, clearly there's like blogs and Instagram and Twitter, YouTube. All the services that we are using are also used by criminals. This is pretty obvious. But it's also true that, I mean, there's a one say, and usually in this area we say every new technology opens the door to new form of crime. It's true, but it's also important to understand how much is growing and how much is affecting. Before, there was the gentleman saying that we should think more about users, for example, and consumers. I think it's very important to understand that cybercrime is not only an issue of the private sector, the public sector, and often we tend to try to identify the different areas because it's easy, because it simplifies things, but the problem is that cybercrime is a worldwide phenomenon. Clearly, internet has no borders, therefore criminals have no borders. There's a problem with jurisdiction. There are problems with investigations. I think that afterwards the gentleman from Europol will tell us something on this. And everything mixed up with the fact that cyberspace is made by people. It's true, there are tools, there are technicalities that make the cyberspace often also difficult for the large public to get, but cyberspace is made by people. I think that one of the biggest mistakes, especially in approaching the issue of cybercrime or cybersecurity, is considering the life online as something completely separated from the life offline. Criminals were very smart because they understood immediately they can operate online, but they can also have sort of hybrid activities. So we see more and more criminals going online for doing part of their activities and then having manifestations, let's say, of their activities offline. And this is very important to understand because I think that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So I'm sometimes smiling when when I listen people say, oh my God, it's a cyber fraud. A cyber fraud, it's a fraud. It's just, you just use another mean to commit the fraud, but it's always a fraud. So we need to change a little bit our mindset in approaching cyberspace and analyzing the criminal phenomenon on cyberspace. Which are the current cyber threats? Here, a little bit of geeky things, but just a few, I promise. No, just for, also because I think it's very important to make people more comfortable with the words that we are using. And so I just made a rough estimation of which are the current threats. Technically speaking, more and more we see a type of attack like code injection and exploit kits. Well, botnets are pretty famous and they've been there for a while, but they're massively used. And more we see, for example, botnet used on social network. I don't think that before we've mentioned enough the social media sphere. And, well, definitely we have the old traditional friends like phishing through fraud mails and websites. We have distributed denial of service attacks. Data breaches are pretty worrying. I think you followed all the issues, for example, with large breaches of databases, for example, of universities in the States, but also breaches of, for example, database of big companies. And, well, rogueware, scarware, and spam is still, let's say, one of the favorite type of attack by criminals. As I mentioned before, what they are attacking different type of technology, but the most important thing here is that they are attacking people. Okay, so behind the mobile computing, before it was mentioned, cloud computing, critical infrastructure, social technology, big data and trusted infrastructures, behind all these, there are people. And that's why it's also so important, and I think that before we haven't spoken enough about that, but I'm sure that with Eva we'll do this. It's very difficult to say, okay, there's just one type of attack, attacking only mobile computing. Okay, nowadays everything is extremely complex because criminals are getting smarter and smarter, and especially before it was easy because they were interested in money. Okay, now they understood that once money spent is gone, so why don't focusing on data, for example, and data of people and as was mentioned before, of companies and also of governments are definitely more lucrative than just money. And a step forward, it's intellectual property, for example. So why don't focusing our activities, part of our activities, on intellectual property? Why I'm saying part of our activities? Because what we're seeing more and more, and what I think it's a little bit worrying, is the fact that often we don't understand that behind a phishing attack, okay, so, oh my God, I put my password on a phishing website. Behind that, there might be a bigger picture, a bigger landscape, where, for example, the money that was stolen from me is used to launder other money, and it's used to other type of activities. So I think we should move from the idea of the hackers, which is staying in a small room, coding, clicking a button, and entering into the Pentagon. We need really to think that cyber criminals, the real bad guys, are getting organized. They're getting very professional on this, and this is, in my humble opinion, the big challenge, and where law enforcement and judiciary efforts should be put on. There are also some other conditions, basically, that are affecting the cyberspace landscape regarding cybercrime. First of all, well, the financial crisis. I didn't put here, but I don't know, how many of you have heard of Hackerville in Romania? Basically, okay, you're law enforcement. No, basically there's this city in Romania, but I recently discovered that there's also one city in Brazil, and I'm sure also in other countries we have the same phenomenon. Basically in Romania what happened, that it was a sort of like Silicon Valley of cybercrime. So basically all the citizens of this very small place were entertaining hacking activities. Mainly it was spam, hosting criminal services, credit card fraud, and they were all from the same place. And well, there was the investigation. They busted the criminals. It was, I mean, it's an interesting case. But the thing that I was more interested in is an interview of one of these guys. And this guy, pretty young, said, I mean, there's no work. I'm paid for something that I have the skill of doing. So, I mean, I'm just paid for doing what I like. I have no other options. During the universities, I did only sacrifice, and on the other hand, the state is just speaking about taxes and the fact that there's no money. And I think we also need to think that often a type of organized criminals are flourishing also because people cannot find other alternatives. A phenomenon that we're seeing more and more is that there are very, let's say, skilled hackers, if we want to call it like that, that are, for example, developing software and tools that then they put on the underground market, and they are bought by other criminals. Should they be considered liable? Should they be considered part, for example, of the organized group since they just wrote the code? This is clearly an open issue. Well, the ICT in developing countries, I mentioned it before, internet has no borders. For example, in developing countries, there's more and more, it's more and more increasing the use of mobile technologies. Specifically, the use of mobile banking is a little bit destabilizing, let's say, the online banking environment, because it was mentioned also before, every nation has its own law, his own rules, and maybe they're very different from the one of other countries. I remember there's the case, for example, of Russia, where there's a very famous organized group which is called RBN, Russian Business Network, and they started their business long ago, and for example, they started with spam, okay? They were selling spam and they were hosting criminal services. So I'm a criminal and I want to rent a botnet for sending out a massive spam. Okay, I can do this for you. And for example, at that time, spam was not criminalized. So, I mean, often criminals also use this sort of like gaps in legislation, and they go clearly where it's more profitable. And then the availability and accessibility of hacking tools and online market. I think in a couple of slides after I put an expression that I call it hacking prêt-à-porter, meaning that more and more criminals don't need to develop their own skills. They can find it on in the underground market. So in the underground market, which is a sort of like parallel economy, and that you can find in what is called the underground web, not only, I mean, there were some articles saying, oh, you can find that they, for example, they trade in Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, and I'm sorry to say, but your credit card details are not that valuable, because at the very beginning, oh my God, I want the identity of this person, so I need the social card number, I need the address and everything, and it was not that easy. I mean, let's put 5 or 6 years ago. But nowadays, all our life is online. And also details that we don't think that we have shared. And so it's very easy for criminals to basically package different services. More or less, I mean, your identity can cost, I don't know, if you are very valuable, if you have a lot of contacts on LinkedIn or on Twitter, Twitter followers and so on and so forth, maybe $50. I mean, it's not that much. But why? Because there are a lot of identities sold there. And an interesting thing is that more and more we see in the underground market selling hacking tools, okay? So I want to send spam, but I'm absolutely not a technological person. I rent a botnet. I just install the software, for example, on my computer, and I can use it without needing any specific or technical skills. Well, I didn't mention it before, but in my institute, we developed a project which is called Hackers Profiling. At the very beginning, back in 2004, we started because we were a little bit like, I cannot say pissed in public, so please don't say it, but we were a little bit like disturbed by the fact that the word hackers was definitely misused, okay? More and more it was used hackers as same thing as like criminals. So we developed this project. And the first phase of the project, it was between 2004, 2006, and it was very interesting because we had the profile of very different type of hackers, and we started seeing at that time that in the cyberspace, more and more there were people looking not so much at, oh, how this system is made, I want to understand which are the bugs, the flaws, but more and more about money or about property of other people's. Might be company secrets or military secrets, and what we now see as, for example, state-sponsored attack. Nowadays, for sure, the cyberspace environment is very, very different. And so we sat down and I'm sharing actually the question that we ask ourselves with you, and I don't have a clear answer. Basically, we ask, are mainly politically or financially motivated the people that are now acting? There was, I think it was in 2011, 2012, that there was the big flourishing of reports, especially from the private sector regarding Anonymous, for example, and all the trends of hacktivism, which clearly it's a very interesting topic. As I mentioned before, I do believe that still people criminals financially motivated are a little bit more concerned to me. Are they actively working, for example, with new and conventional digital tribes rather than traditional organized criminal groups? And also, are they actively or simply passively working with organized criminal groups in order, for example, to support their activities? I go super fast. Okay. I go super fast. I just want to give you a couple of examples to concrete cases that I think can sum up a bit what I wanted to tell you. Basically, these are the what I think are the main characteristic of the mixture between the web and the organized crime. It had an impact on organized crime. I worked a long time on trafficking human beings and specifically on the organized crime aspect. And I can tell you, for example, certain African groups, they have specific features, okay? So they treat the victims of human trafficking in a certain ways, and they behave in the criminal environment in a certain way. Completely different, for example, from Southeastern European countries, or very different from the Italian, for example, organized criminals. In cyberspace, everything is mixed, and groups are not so identifiable. Patterns are completely different, and often you have groups that get together just for one specific activity, and then they are just gone. So that's why it's also very difficult, also for the law enforcement, the investigation part. One thing that I didn't mention before is the business model. The day that the criminals discovered Adam Smith, it was the day that really the game changed, because they started in building serious enterprises. I mentioned before Russian Business Network. There are a couple of other cases. I'm sorry. Oh, it's Russian, GlavMed, and Innovative Market in Ukraine. And it was fascinating because they even had a LinkedIn account. So they had it was a sort of professional company with human resources department. They were, I mean, they have brochure with, we sell this type of activities. And for example, I think it was GloveMed that it was the responsible, let's say, of, you remember that it was, I think, 3 or 4 years ago that there was a massive spam of Canadian pharmacy. It was basically their fault. So they are really getting very well organized in a professional way. I just decided to leave you with some concrete cases. This is a case from 2012. It's called carding operation. And it's an example of law enforcement cooperation directed at carding crimes. So basically, internet used to traffic in and exploit the stolen credit card, bank account, and also other personal identification information, so mainly what is called identity theft. And the point is that since they are organized, the impact of their activity clearly amplifies. And so the estimate is that they attacked hundreds of thousands of victims globally. This is it's interesting because, as I mentioned before, there are no borders, so you can retrieve online. There's the list of the people involved in this case, and you will see it's coming from the court order, and you have like the name of the person, the country, the age, and there were 13 countries involved. So again, before criminals, well, first of all, they need to make efforts to talk with each other, not to be intercepted by the police. And secondly, often since they have very different, for example, culture and for example, language barriers, so we were used to, as I mentioned before, to have groups that were pretty identifiable, analyzing their characteristics. Here we have 13 countries, very different people. Okay, the age, they were more or less between 20 and 30, more or less, but it was the only, let's say, common element among those people. And there were 24 arrests, and apparently the FBI estimates that they saved $205 million from dollars from falling into the fraudster hands. I just want to quote this case. I know it's a relatively small case. The Italian post office. It's again, I mean, a pretty easy scheme. They created a website where basically victims were providing the credit card and email details. There was a second step where they were creating the fake debit cards with the details of the victims. And then the third creative way, let's say, of using the money, they were using the fake credit cards on online gambling site to disperse the stolen assets. Apart from the scheme and apart from the fact that, again, it involved different countries and it's a good example of law enforcement cooperation, is the first case that it was recognized as organized crime. What I mean is that we have a United Nations Convention, which is the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, the UNTOC. And because the problem, I said it at the very beginning, we need to try to find definition. Up to now, we don't have a global definition of cybercrime, for example. And we don't have a global definition of cyberterrorism or of terrorism in itself. So it's very difficult to apply these categories. For example, for organized crime, I said during this talk often, oh, okay, they are organized criminals, but to identify an organized criminal group as organized crime, you need to have certain conditions to be in place, like the composition of the group and which type of activity they are making. But the most important point, and that's why I wanted to give you this example, is because here it's the first time that it was recognized that also organized crime have a very big impact in the online environment. And I leave you with, if I change the slide, I leave you with, it's not changing.
We are attacked.
People behind, yeah. It was a Facebook case. I just want to leave you with this Facebook case. Apparently, this was the first public Facebook attack. It's called CoupFace, and it's a multi-platform computer war that originally targeted not only Facebook, but it's the, let's say, it's the most famous one. It was the most famous one at that time. And also MySpace, High5, Bebo, Friendster, and Twitter. And when I said criminals are creative, okay, and so to catch criminals, you need to be creative as well. Basically, the gang lured the victims through sort of sexy videos. And if you click, you've been asked to update the Flash player and directed to the download page, as it often happened. In reality, the victim was downloading the CoupFace malware. And the malware sent constant fake antivirus ads to the user. And basically, the gang was profiting from unaware buyers and especially unsuspecting advisors. This is also a system that it was recently used, I mean, not so recently, but that is also used by, let's say, recognized terrorist groups that are, for example, for funding their activities, are putting, for example, fake ads or fake links to Amazon and this type of website, basically to get the money. So just to wrap up, actually I had a, can I show it? I'm very proud of this slide. So, but my point is just that I just give you a lot of data and a lot of information, but just to give you an idea of how complex it is. And within this specific framework, really the fact that, first of all, we need to talk about concrete cases, and policy level and legislative level are very important, but we have one big problem, which is how fast the technology and internet is evolving and how fast criminals are reacting to this. So we need to be fast and creative as well. And on the other hand, we really need to concentrate our efforts where they are most needed. And I think organized cybercrime is a good example of that. Thank you.
Francesca. Thank you.